Hello and welcome to RADTV live at 5:25 on CCTV, Chittenden County, Channel 17 Centre for Media and Media Democracy and Town Meeting Television. For those who haven't seen our show before, RAD stands for Rights and Democracy. We are a grassroots, people-powered organisation committed to creating an independent political movement for long-lasting fundamental change in Vermont and New Hampshire. This is a call-in show, so feel free, if you're so inclined, to give us a ring. Our number is 802-862-3966. So if you have any questions for our panel this evening, please call in. And if you like what you hear today, please consider donating to Rights and Democracy. You can find it at radvt.org or radnh.org. And remember to watch our show on the fourth Friday of every month, although we are coming in on the fifth Friday this month. So tune in next month in June to see what we're going to talk about that month. I'm your host, Tom Proctor. Tonight our topic is housing in Burlington and how do we build a more equitable city. Burlington has been facing a housing crunch for several years, with the city becoming a state punchline for its out-of-control rent, low occupancy rates and eye-wateringly high house prices. With the city holding a 2019 BTV Housing Summit on June 11th, on RAD we're going to examine the proposed solutions being offered, how effective the current measures have been, and what needs to be done to make housing more accessible in Burlington, and accessible for those who are of working class rather than those of just the fortunate few. I have three guests this evening. First we have Tony Reddington.
Hi. Excuse me. First, I'm a founding contributor to RADS. I have to admit that to begin with. I got involved with looking at housing in Burlington as a member of the Coalition for a Livable City. We were looking into the impacts of housing at what we now call the hole in the ground city center. But I also went back to sort of my heritage because I was a director of the New Hampshire Housing Commission for 3 years and a statewide housing planner. And since beginning here, I've looked at some rental structures, compared the rents in Burlington to the enviable rents in Plattsburgh, New York.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight. We also have Zariah Hightower.
I'm a young professional who lives in Burlington. I'm also on the Development Review Board, and I have a history of studying urban and regional development in graduate school.
Fantastic. And we also have David White.
I am an urban planner working for the City of Burlington. I am currently the Director of Planning and Zoning, have been for about 12 years, and I'm currently the Interim Director of the Community and Economic Development Office for the City. So I'm right in the middle of this whole housing conversation.
Well, fantastic. Thank you all so much for joining me tonight. And David, I'm going to start with you. The issues of housing has been a problem for many years. Where do you feel we have gone wrong in the past to contribute to this problem? Where have we gone right? And what new policies are going to be introduced that you feel will make a tangible difference?
Sure. Great question. Like many cities across the country, Burlington has had a regulatory structure in place that defines how much development can occur, where, what scale, what level of intensity is known commonly as zoning. Those zoning regulations, again, like many communities around the country, have been fairly restrictive in where development can happen, how much development can happen, and that has an effect on housing availability and supply. We also have, as Zora knows, we have a complicated regulatory process. It's cumbersome. It is, most importantly, I think it's unpredictable in its outcomes, which make it really difficult for a property owner, for a developer, for just a community member to understand what can happen and kind of what are the implications of that. So over the course of the last several years, we've been working to make modifications to those regulations to first and foremost make them more predictable, but also look at where in the community are appropriate places for more intensive mixed-use development and where are places that really are not. We just adopted a new city master plan back in March, which articulates this at kind of broad strokes level, but we're really looking into where can we make small changes. In residential areas, the notion of the accessory dwelling unit, which will be a topic of a conversation at the Housing Summit, where there's an opportunity here to create an additional unit on a property, makes that property more affordable to the property owner, as well as creating a housing opportunity, perhaps for a family member, perhaps not. That's one strategy, but there are kind of a host of both small and large efforts that we're looking at.
Can I actually just have a follow-up question for that then? When you say take down some of these regulations in order to have some private homeowners to maybe add an extra dwelling onto their house, is it these small scale changes that are going to make an overall difference, or are you guys looking during this summit to look at any large scale developments that might ease the housing crisis that we have?
So not in so much as specifically focusing on large scale developments, but one of the topics in the Housing Summit has to do with parking. We require parking spaces to be associated with all new development in the city, whether it's residential or non-residential. That has a huge impact on the ability to utilize particularly smaller sites, whether it's downtown or elsewhere, but certainly has an effect on larger sites. And the challenge, or the key issue being that in our downtown, we've got on the order of 8,000 parking spaces, right? At any given time, about a third of them are vacant. There's got to be a better way to make better use of those existing parking spaces, manage them differently, rather than just keep making more and more and increasing the cost of development, and particularly of housing.
Tony, now we're going to move on to you. Mayor Weinberger has stated that he believes that the answer to housing crisis is just more housing. How much do you agree with this statement?
Well, first I want to agree with David White that requiring parking for housing is looked at today from an urban development standpoint as a worthless and actually anti-housing. If the developer wants to develop some housing and he feels he can do it without parking, it's his risk, his money. Why should the city get into that mix? Let me say this, that I think we need to give Mayor Weinberger some credit here in terms of housing development in Burlington. And when you answer the question of is the way to get out of our housing crunch through building housing, we've actually already tested that. As David well knows, we've developed about 1,000 units of housing in the last 2 or 3 years through the efforts, in great part through Mayor Weinberger. And right now, if you take the so-called private housing market, which you have to subtract the students and the nonprofit and the housing authority units, we probably have somewhere between a 5 and 10% vacancy rate in that private market. With what? We have about 30 or 40 units coming online, overlooking Lake Champlain behind the COTS building off North Avenue. We don't know how many units are coming online right now that have been completed in the Bayberry project on Grove Street. And then we have 50 or 60 units of what's going to be 700 units plus at Cambrian Rise. And we haven't even mentioned the city place location, which I, for one, agree we should build and get done because it's been approved. But we also think it needs to be done with what's been agreed upon in terms of a city agreement. Okay, so we've already tested the fact that we cannot build ourselves out of housing because we have a lot of vacancies. We have another 1,000 units coming online, and the rents have stabilized somewhat, which is good, 2 to 3% increase a year. But in fact, the problem is not anymore building more housing. The problem is providing the ability of people to provide people with assistance, so that they can therefore buy or rent apartments on the private marketplace. As a practical matter, then, it's no longer more units. It's a question of providing demand, the ability of people to afford these units. And I think that in that sense, Weinberger's been a success, but we've gotten as far as we can go. Building more housing will not solve the needs of these people. And over the last 2 or 3 years, I'm on the Community of Vermont Elders Policy Committee, and we deal with housing. what we found is that over the last 3 years, we've gone from 1,700 to 2,000 people on the waiting list at the Burlington Housing Authority and Cathedral Senior Housing. So while we've been building a lot of housing and we have a lot of vacancies, in fact, the need, those people who cannot afford the housing that's in the market, has grown. So Weinberger is correct. We should have built some housing. We've done it. We've done as much as we can there. Now we have to concentrate on assistance. I'll talk about that later.
Can I just jump in? I think one thing a lot of people would disagree with Tony on is that there are a lot of vacancies out there. We've had a historically very low vacancy rate, particularly in the rental market, hovering around 1%. Most people will say more in the order of 5% is what is indicative of a healthy market. So it pops up and down here and there. When new buildings and new units come online, it jumps up, but it has always trended back down to hovering a little bit more than 1%. But he's absolutely right that just building more housing isn't the answer. There's actually a raging debate all across the country around this very question right now. There's no question that we need to increase the supply, but we also need to have other mechanisms in place. And we're really fortunate here in Burlington that we have a tool like inclusionary zoning, so that when new housing is being created, new affordable housing is being created as well. We have a housing trust fund that we use to help support making housing affordable to those who need it. And we have a wonderful partnership of nonprofits out there building housing, again, for the most vulnerable. So Tony's right, it's not just building more housing, you have to have the other supports in place. But at the end of the day, you need to increase the supply.
Okay. Well, Zariah, it'd be good to hear from you. And you're, as a member of the Development Review Board in Burlington, you have a chance to see a lot of what isn't working in Burlington with regard to zoning and permitting. So have you noticed anything in particular that negates better housing?
So I haven't been around Burlington quite as long as Tony or David. I've been on the review board for about a year and a half. And unfortunately, I think I'm going to sound a lot like it's going to be very, very similar things that we're talking about. I think one of the big things is, to the point of parking, is I think I was surprised at how often we end up talking about parking when we're talking about housing, and how often that's used to prevent or delay or other things, different kinds of development from, single family homes, changing maybe into more of a multi-use to larger developments. And to the fact that I don't think that parking is the future of urban development. That's a sad thing to see. I'm excited about the accessory dwellings. I know that will be part of the summit. Another thing I think will be Airbnbs, because Airbnbs are on the affordability side for both. So people who maybe have a home that is larger than they want it to be, because we don't allow a lot of subdivision, who would like to rent out a room. But on the other hand, when you have the low vacancy rate that Burlington does, it can also really, really eat into that rental market and raise rents in ways that we don't want to see in a small, and definitely not a big city, but definitely also not Burlington. And so I hope that as we're thinking about making policies for things like Airbnbs and short-term rentals, that it can be a very progressive policy that encourages, if you're an owner-occupied rental, that you maybe can get that additional income without encouraging any kind of, buying up of properties in order to rent them out for short-term rentals, which would very quickly eat into our limited housing option.
And as I understand it, you are a prospective first-time home buyer. So what has been your experience in terms of looking for a home in Burlington?
Yeah, I would love to buy a home in Burlington. I made an offer on a home, within 24 hours of it going on the market, 5% above asking. Did not get it. I think that's the general story of anyone who's trying to buy a house that's less than $300,000. There's very, very limited housing options for purchase if you're not in a upper income bracket. And so, I think this is true of, Vermont in general, but especially in Burlington, it's a very competitive market, and it's hard to, imagine staying as a young professional if you do want to own your own home.
Well, this goes back to Tony's point then, that it's not just about the how many houses we have, it's about the affordability of the houses that are available. And although I have looked at the occupancy rates and it's hovering around 1.4, which is very low, and this kind of is open to anyone here, is there any kind of policies in place to really help those on the lower end of the income bracket becoming homeowners in the city, or is that not a possibility at all for anyone who's making, say, less than $30,000 a year?
Well, I think the Champlain Housing Trust is the best example of a nonprofit housing developer and housing manager that really invests a tremendous amount of time and energy in the whole spectrum of the housing ladder, as it's known, from homelessness to homeownership, in helping people make those transitions, both financially and what's affordable for somebody to get into, but also just the experience for somebody who's a first-time homeowner. It's fairly daunting. My oldest son just been through this process and spend a tremendous amount of time and energy to understand, what am I getting into, what are the costs, what do all these things mean. CHT does a great job, as well as others, in helping people navigate that process too.
And Tony, I'm going to direct this one to you. You've been a member of the Coalition for Liverpool City for a long time now. As a group, how do you feel that the city should be helping first-time home buyers or lower-income home buyers to get access to housing outside, say, the Champlain Housing Trust?
Well, let's start by saying that there really has been a revolution in this nation and also in our state over the last 30 to 40 years. And this basically comes down to income inequality. We have the worst distribution of income right now than we've had since the initial recording, whenever they started recording this back in the early 1900s. And when it comes, and really the last place in terms of allowing people to to deal with their needs, which come down to food. We have a food system that is national through the food stamp program. It's universal, supplemented by local food shelves. But 90% of the money that's going into providing food substances is coming from the federal level. Then we have the affordable health care situation, which, well, Rocky, we now have sort of at least in the basic form, ability to provide health care to everyone regardless of income. One can argue how efficient and what the costs are, but the basics are in place. The one location in terms of human need we do not have is affordable housing. And for the first time, I've been in the, off and on in the housing business for 40 years. And for the first time, I saw a bill proposed by, or a solution proposed by Senator Harris, who comes from universal health care in San Francisco, where everybody, with or without U.S. citizenship, has free health care, who has that California experience, who proposed getting around the Champlain Housing Trust and getting around the zoning and getting around all the regulations and getting around the banks. Basically saying, okay, everybody gets, we have a universal coverage. You pay 30% of your income for rent, up to income $100,000. And at the end of the year, when you make out your taxes, we'll give you the difference between what you paid in your rent and 30% of your income. And for the first time, we've sort of broken through all the folderol of housing and all the baloney to meet people's need today where they are, and everybody. The 2,000 people on our waiting list, and with 200 more low-income seniors every year, growing new ones in Chittenden County alone who are poor or near poor. That situation is getting worse, and we're not even, unless we go to a system, and it has to be federally supported, base federal support, we really are just whistling in the dark when it comes to housing and meeting the housing needs.
Okay. So for you, this comes down to a federal issue rather than a state level issue?
Right now, Tom, have 13,000 households in Vermont. 1 out of 8 households who rent receive affordable housing assistance, where they pay, under the federal programs, 30% of their income max for housing. They have stable and secure housing, because if their income goes down, so does their rent. That program stalled about 20 years ago. In a sense, it's extending that, but it's basically putting the power to the individual through their income tax, like you do with the income tax credit, that money goes to the individual, not through some federal bureaucracy or the Housing Authority or Champlain Housing Trust. I subscribe obviously to the things that Champlain Housing Trust does, but it's not going to deal with 2,000 people on the waiting list of the Housing Authority here in the city and the increasing numbers at Cathedral Senior.
And I think this kind of like falls into my next question, which I'm going to direct to you, David. Maura Collins from the Vermont Housing Agency said the main issue of access to the housing market, like Tony's been saying, comes down to wages not rising as high as the house prices are. So it's not the case that these houses aren't affordable, it's the fact that we're not getting the pay that we potentially deserve. So how is the city approaching this housing crisis in a holistic fashion that maybe is not just focusing on the housing itself?
Yeah, it's a great question, because housing and jobs are inextricably linked, right? And we really need to focus at least some of our effort in a stronger and more holistic way at economic development strategies that help both existing and future businesses create jobs, create well-paying jobs that allow then for people to afford the housing that we have. In order for the businesses in our city to be successful, and the proprietors of businesses large and small will tell you that one of their biggest issues is housing, affordable, available housing for their employees. We need to have that housing supply that makes it possible for somebody to attract a young professional to move from Boston or move from someplace else to work in a cool job. I mean, Burlington's a really attractive place to be. Lots of people want to be here, but there aren't the jobs that are suitable to their needs. And if they find the job, they can't find an affordable place to live. So one of the things that we're looking to undertake in the upcoming calendar year, or begin to work on in the coming year, really a 2-year project, is an economic development strategy that really focuses on what are the kind of unique assets that we have as a city, as a place. How do we pair those with the needs of existing businesses, the opportunities that we have as being a university town, and really prioritize the work that we do on economic development, and what should the city's role be in helping to advance that.
Okay. Well, we're going to pivot a little bit now. We've been talking a lot about home ownership, but as it's been pointed out, there is a large portion of Burlington especially who are renters, myself included. So David, one of the big problems we do see with renting in Burlington is there is a large amount of slumlords and a large amount of houses that are crumbling and not repaired to the level that they should be. But those living in these places seldom have access to recourse against their landlords. So I was wondering, what can the city do to provide access to those affected by neglectful landlords if they do lack the resources to pursue justice personally?
Yeah, great question. As you may know, and certainly some of your viewers may know, the city has a rental inspection program, referred to as the minimum housing program, that's administered by the Code Enforcement Office, where I believe it's every 5 years. Historically, the ordinance says every 5 years these units are supposed to be inspected for minimum compliance with a minimum set of standards. In 2015, the Code Enforcement Office started a new program looking at this, where when they inspect a property, they assign it based on the quality of the result of that inspection and the timeliness of compliance of the landowner, either a 1 through 5 rating system, essentially, which means that they'll get another inspection in another year if they find that compliance is a challenge, or is up to 5 years where compliance is not a challenge, that they're buildings at a very high standard. I think we'll see, they've just completed that entire inspection cycle of all of the housing units. So over the course of the next year or so, we should see that system really taking effect and targeting on an annual or biannual basis those properties that are most in need of improving their the quality of life that they provide to their tenants.
Now, it does sound like a great program, but I suppose my concern hearing that is a lot of renters in Burlington are renters for maybe a year, maybe 2 years. I don't know many people who have stayed in the same place for really longer than 2 or 3 years. And especially if you're a student, how do you hold landlords accountable when they know they're only going to get expected maybe at the very most once per year, when your tenants are always going to be rotating out of these houses?
Right. Well, the short answer to that is ultimately to be in touch with the code enforcement office. If a tenant has a concern about the safety of the unit that they're in, their first call should be to the code enforcement office. Have a conversation with them, see what information they can glean and what assistance that Bill Ward's office can offer them. That's really the first phone call. And even if you are looking to rent, you'll want to know, well, is this a 1-year renewal or is this a 5-year renewal? And that information is public information, is available from that office as well.
Okay. Tony, as we've already mentioned, the average renter in Burlington is spending 40% of their income on housing, with rents likely being the more financially vulnerable, renters likely being more financially vulnerable than homeowners. How do we bring this percentage down? And you did kind of allude to it already in our talks.
Right. First, I want to say that I haven't been here as long as a lot of people too. I only moved into Burlington in 2011. I could not find an apartment anywhere, and I just lucked out, and I've been there for the duration. I think there's two key things. We need to form tenants unions, provide education, and there are available tenant education or renter education clinics that are available in the city. Yep. We need to publicize that. We're doing that through our neighborhood planning assemblies and so forth. So there's that aspect. That in fact, and just very quickly, only about the 2,000 or 2,000 to 4,000 folks, we're a rental community. 10,000 housing units are rental, 7,000 homeowner. Burlington is a rental market, not a homeowner market. Part of the reason you're having a problem finding a house. But the point I'm getting at is that very clearly the renters who have a problem are at the top of the layer cake. The bottom layers being public housing, Champlain Housing Trust, students who are really relatively well-to-do. And so that the so-called private market is only about 5,000 of the 10,000 units, and that's where the vacancies are. And that's where we need to concentrate.
Okay. And quickly, Zara, unfortunately we are running out of time, but from a renter's perspective, is there anything you feel the city could do to aid renters in Burlington?
Oh, well, I wanted a more expansive answer to that, more than the city even. Yeah, I think one, changing the dynamic around keeping Burlington as it is. It's not, despite the fact that it is a renter's market, it's a lot of single-family homes with people, living in 4 to 6 bedroom homes, illegally or not illegally. And that's not, I think, what a lot of renters want is, they do want often some privacy and more 2-bedroom options. So I think allowing more housing that the renters typically want, rather than trying to squeeze renters in what in a lot of ways still is kind of a historically single-family home city, would be at least a start. And then I think a lot of the things that Tony was talking about would certainly be welcome.
If I can just jump in on that as well. The key thing is that there are choices, right? There are a variety of different needs, different people, different stages of life. You need to have a wide range of choices in the marketplace available.
Well, thank you all so much for coming on to this evening, and thank you for watching. We will be back again next month, right back here on the 4th Friday of June at 5:25. Once again, guys, thank you so much for coming in, sharing your views. It's been incredibly valuable for me to hear, at least.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good night.